Yes, please. The first session is titled Aesthetics and Environmental Engagement, Sustainability. And the initial questions that we posed to the speakers is, what is the role of aesthetics in environmental art? Any difference between practice of environmental activism and environmental art? But I asked each speaker to just take it and run with it, because I wanted to, each speaker to get at it from different perspectives. And the first speaker is Arnold Valiant, Professor Emeritus of Long Island University. So Arnold, as I mentioned, I'm doing away with lengthy introduction because that will take 15 minutes. So, okay. Whichever is comfortable.
I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the organizers of the symposium. It's been going on for so long and such an important project for the organizers and the participants. And I'm delighted that it has finally reached its flowering. And I hope this will serve as a kind of overall orientation to what we're doing. When I first reflected on the title of this symposium, I thought it could be read as an invitation to critique the academic practice of aesthetics as a scholarly discipline, to identify its limitations, its subservience to fashionable academic ideologies, its alienation from much of what was and is being done by artists and of all sorts and traditions, past as well as present. Such a critique would serve a useful purpose, certainly, but its value would have been largely negative and might have induced the imaginative format of the symposium to descend to the level of intellectual bickering reminiscent of philosophical conferences. At the same time, the title of the symposium is suggestive, perhaps too suggestive, for questioning aesthetics can mean several different things. One, perhaps the most obvious, is raising questions about the field of aesthetics. What issues should aesthetics be concerned with? What values does aesthetics center around? And how does their relevance vary? Where does aesthetics belong in the domain of a scholarship? What kind of theoretical account can best capture the workings of the aesthetic? Questioning aesthetics here means questioning the discipline, surely a purgative process that is useful for any discipline. But there is another meaning, an adjectival meaning in questioning aesthetics. It is to consider aesthetics as an inquiry that questions by its very nature. A questioning aesthetics as a distinctive kind of questioning, aesthetic questioning. What is the particular character of the aesthetic that places things in question? How does aesthetics question? What kind of questioning is the aesthetic, and is aesthetics especially capable of doing? It is, I think, a questioning that judges by an aesthetic standard. That is, it starts from sensory experience and evaluates things by perceptual criteria. As Michael said, aesthetics had to do with sense perception, sensibility, sensation. Of what specifically Is aesthetics an appropriate critique? Of what specifically is aesthetics an appropriate critique? Here its scope is boundless, and aesthetics quickly becomes a critique of the human world, of its institutions, its practices, its justices and injustices, its sense of things on the basis of the perceptual conditions they inhabit and promote. What might such a critique reveal? What might it lead? Where might it lead if aesthetics became the questioner? What is in aesthetics that questions? The adjectival meaning assigns a critical function to aesthetics. It suggests that aesthetics can be the basis of a social or a political critique in evaluating practices by their consequences for the sensible world of human life. There is an implicit humanism here, for the qualitative perceptual richness of experience becomes the standard of judgment. In a sense, these two meanings of questioning aesthetics may be inseparable, because a questioning aesthetics suggests an answer to the question of what aesthetics is. Lest this seem too convoluted, let me suggest how the questioning of and by aesthetics relates to the subject of this first session, environmental engagement and sustainability. Both engagement and sustainability embody ethical concerns. The first about the contribution of aesthetic experience to the quality of living, and the second about the ways of life that sustain a balance between production and consumption, a balance that is increasingly fractured and threatened to the point of rendering the future of human life precarious. Our faith in a technological fix for the ills of excess has reached the blank wall of impossibility when exhausted resources cannot be replenished and environmental changes cannot be reversed. We are facing the fact that we cannot insulate ourselves from the consequences of unrestrained environmental consumption and careless depredation. The fact is that we have become consumers of environment and are obliterating the very ground of our sustenance. Hence, the inescapable criterion of sustainability, which implies a concern for attending to the aesthetic values inherent in the survival of civilizations that are necessarily human and morally humane. Indeed, the very subject of survival requires a concern for environment, and just as the survival of human civilization requires safeguarding aesthetic values. I'm sorry if I seem to be puzzling over my text, but the light is very bad here and I can't see my own pages, so I hope Oh, that's a help, thank you. I should have complained earlier. This suggests an answer to where we began in questioning aesthetics, and for several reasons. One is that it challenges the tradition that confines aesthetic value to natural beauty and the arts. Environment is more than striking scenery and accommodating landscape design. It denotes a contextual condition that implicates and includes the human percipient. Environment is a collective term for the multiple settings of human life activity and their dystopic manifestations as well as the benign ones. Environment is not an external, distant object or phenomenon, and the arts are more than objects and occasions for delectation, since they enter into the very substance of human life experience. Both the arts and environment are conditions of aesthetic engagement. So the second form of aesthetic questioning, a questioning aesthetics, introduces the need for normative criteria. It invites us to identify in the range of aesthetic perception values that are negative and harmful in environmental conditions and experience, and those values that enrich our life experiences and lead us into harmony with the world we create and inhabit. Thus, a questioning aesthetics gives aesthetic values and concerns central importance, for the ubiquity of aesthetic perception implicates the full range of normative experience. And the normative question introduces issues concerning the negative domains of aesthetics and the necessity for aesthetic criticism of environmental experience. A questioning aesthetics is therefore fundamental, for it promotes inquiry grounded on and in our perceptual world. When aesthetics questions, everything responds. I expect we shall hear some of these answers these 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Next speaker is Emily Brady from University of Edinburgh.
Well, thank you, Arnold, for kicking that off with such interesting comments. I was jotting things down the whole time. And I'd like to thank Yuriko, Michael, and the others involved in organizing this event. It's really great to have been invited to speak here. I think I'll be giving you something a bit different, but perhaps a sort of segue between Arnold's talk and Patricia's talk as well. Across academia and the wider public, current debates about climate change, as well as the concept of the Anthropocene, have emphasized the need for thinking long-term and intergenerationally. Environmental aesthetics, given its interest in environments, is in an ideal position to explore what I will call intergenerational aesthetics. Intergenerational aesthetics makes demands on us to perceive and imagine from the present to the past and to the future and beyond through our connections to geology, ecology, and the cosmos. To explore intergenerational aesthetics, here today, I'm going to focus on the particular themes of cosmology and time. I begin with some scene setting from 18th century aesthetics before bringing these themes into dialogue with environmental aesthetics. I conclude with a look at 3 art practices that, for me, figure as openers for intergenerational aesthetics. To work within my 15 minutes, coverage of these ideas will necessarily be pretty brief. At least because of emerging interest in the science of human nature and natural history, 18th century philosophers in Britain and the continent write generously, not only about the arts, but also about the natural world. Nature is certainly a contested concept today, and in the 18th century too. It has many meanings, including religious ones, especially when we look back to the 18th century. For example, nature, with an uppercase N, is used by Shaftesbury to denote the cosmological whole that is divine creation. When nature, with a capital N, is used to describe the natural world as created by God for Hutcheson and 18th century philosophers, this also included nature with a small n. The empirical reality of the universe, mountains, rivers, insects, mammals, plants, and natural environments of sky, sea, land, and so on. What I find intriguing about these historical approaches is that aesthetic value works alongside scientific discoveries of their day, which means that they often approach aesthetics more holistically, as I shall show, through cosmological and temporal qualities. Francis Hutcheson's empiricist approach articulates beauty grasped by an aesthetic sense through perception that is immediate rather than mediated by cognition or knowledge. His method for examining natural beauty begins with forms and patterns that we understand through mathematics, astronomy, and the other sciences. Yet he is clear that the mark of beauty, which he calls uniformity amidst variety, is experienced through the aesthetic sense rather than through knowledge, thereby maintaining a non-cognitive sort of approach. Hutchison shows a genuine interest in harmony and order, and his account of natural beauty turns out to be holistic, prioritizing unities above particulars. This is expressed, for example, through temporal relations in cosmology and across the Earth's seasons. He says, "What can exhibit a greater instance of uniformity amidst variety than the constant tenor of revolutions in nearly equal times in each planet around its axis, and the central fire or sun through all the ages of which we have any records? The alternate successions of light and shade, or day and night, constantly pursuing each other around each planet with an agreeable and regular diversity in the times they possess the several hemispheres in the summer, harvest, winter, and spring, and the various phases, aspects, and situations of the planets to each other, their conjunctions and oppositions, in which they suddenly darken each other with their conic shapes and eclipses, are repeated to us at their fixed periods with invariable constancy. These are the beauties which charm the astronomer and make the tedious calculations pleasant." Moving on to the rather sketchy theory of the sublime offered by Hume, we find that the mind is elevated by the vastness of its object, and still farther elevated by the difficulty of the conception, and being obliged every moment to renew its efforts in the transition from one part of time to another, feels a more vigorous and sublime disposition than in a transition through the parts of space. The imagination gives us a proportionable veneration for it. This temporal sublime is both backward and forward-looking, referring to ancient history, but also to eternity, and thus capturing phenomena stretching far into the future. While Hume focused on the example of antiquity to convey his notion, it can easily be applied to landscapes. Indeed, also during the Scottish Enlightenment, John Playfair said of James Hutton's concept of deep time, a notion of geologic time measuring the age of the Earth, that, quote, "the mind seemed to grow giddy by looking so far into the abyss of time." And here an image of Sicker Point, which is an important site for Hutton's theory. I could say much more about time and cosmology and the history of aesthetics, but because time is short, I now bring these ideas into dialogue with environmental aesthetics in order to motivate intergenerational aesthetics. Intergenerational aesthetics takes time seriously. It engages with the temporal dynamic character of aesthetic qualities, concepts, and phenomena. It seeks to make explicit the ways in which humans are diachronically intertwined with ecological, geological, and sentient others. In these ways, it encourages long-term thinking, requiring us to perceive and imagine beyond present lives. Environmental aesthetics is largely concerned with a more environmental situated approach. For example, in a forest of sequoia trees, we find complex ecosystems involving various forms of interactions, as well as growth, decay, the effects of weather, the seasons, and so on. The more dynamic characters of environments and ecology shape the range of aesthetic qualities we find and reveal how these qualities change over time in light of various factors. We witness the rapid change in the life and death of an exquisite mayfly, or the relatively slow change of glacial erosion. The temporal aspect of individual life spans ecologies and geologies, requiring us to engage with aesthetic phenomena more holistically, and at least in terms of a past and future. We can find a model for this on a more compressed scale when Holmes Ralston asks us to appreciate the beauty of an elk carcass within the broader ecological story, where decomposition leads to new life. And many of us here know that Yuriko Saito, our chair and brilliant symposium organizer, has written extensively about the role of time and change in the interface between environmental and Japanese aesthetics. We also find environmental thinkers and conservationists who recognize time depth as significant in shaping aesthetic and other values. John Muir's expertise as a geologist and botanist gave him first-hand knowledge of the passage of time and its effects on things. He says, rising at the upper end of the valley to a height of nearly a mile is nobly proportioned and lifelike, the most impressive of all rocks, holding the eye in devout admiration, calling it back again and again from the falls or meadows, or even the mountains beyond. Marvelous cliffs, marvelous in sheer dizzy depth and sculpture, types of endurance. Thousands of years have they stood in the sky exposed to rain, snow, frost, earthquake, and avalanche, yet they still wear the bloom of youth. In the Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold presents an intimate record of the ecology and beauty of a place across a year. And in his moving elegy of a marshland lost to agriculture, we find deep time. A sense of time lies thick and heavy on such a place. Yearly since the Ice Age, it has awakened each spring to the clangor of cranes. The peat layers that comprise the bog are laid down in the basin of an ancient lake. The cranes stand, as it were, upon the sodden pages of their own history. These peats are the compressed remains of the mosses that clogged the pools, of the tamaracks that spread over the moss, of the ice sheet. An endless caravan of generations has built of its own bones this bridge into the future, this habitat where the oncoming host again may live and breed and die. Time also plays out across the aesthetic judgments and preferences made during a person's life, or a community's life, or shifts in landscape tastes across generations. The combination of temporal change on both sides, in aesthetic qualities and subject matter, as well as in appreciation, makes environmental aesthetics, I think, an especially fruitful ground for developing intergenerational aesthetics. My ideas in the talk are inspired by thinking about past and future generations in philosophical discussions of climate change. In moving on to art practice, I won't be engaging with the large field of climate change and the arts. Rather, I want to look at 3 cases of environmental art, loosely defined, which highlight cosmology, time, and the geological, and thereby express the intergenerational rather than the merely present. Let's begin with the heavens above. Many here will be familiar with James Turrell's Rodden Crater, a massive sky observatory being constructed within an extinct volcano in the Arizona desert, which will give observers a chance to participate in celestial events through a range of Turrell's skyscapes and other light rooms. Many different aesthetic values will likely be at work here, such as the beautiful, the sublime, wonder, and others. The Rodden Crater website describes it in this way. While minimally invasive to the external natural landscape, internally the red and black cinder has been transformed into special engineered spaces where the cycles of geologic and celestial time can be directly experienced. A trope which looks to the earth and then rather than sky and space is familiar in Robert Smithson's work. His fascination with the unscenic, the ruined, and the post-industrial pays tribute to the relentless, inevitable forces of nature, especially entropy and geological change. His most famous work, Spiral Jetty, spirals 1,500 feet into the Great Salt Lake near the shore at Roswell Point. This work is dynamic rather than static. Depending on the water level of the lake, it submerges and reemerges. It's now covered with ice crystals, at least the last time that I checked. The artwork operates on various levels, from the sheer physicality of the spiral to the expansive lake site with long stretches of water and land, to ideas about the earth, creation, and mathematics. Smithson described the site in evocative terms. As I looked at the site, it reverberated out to the horizons only to suggest an immobile cyclone, while flickering light made the entire landscape appear to quake. A dormant earthquake spread into the fluttering stillness, into a spinning sensation without movement. The site was a rotary that enclosed itself in an immense roundness. From that gyrating space emerged the possibility of Spiral Jetty. No ideas, no concepts, no systems, no structures, no abstractions could hold themselves together in the actuality of that evidence. This description is striking for the way it captures greatness in a metaphysical mood, tinged with the uncertainty and energy of geological forces. Smithson's work did not hold nature at a distance. Natural forces affect human actions and human structures. Partially buried woodshed, in which he took 20 cartloads of, this is a quote, 20 cartloads of earth and piled them on this woodshed until the central beam cracked, was motivated in part by an interest in, quote, dealing with the unexpected and incorporating that into community. The woodshed resonates with the buried architecture of houses and villages buried in ashes from volcanic eruptions, and for some, expresses the ruptures and disintegration of 1960s America. Smithson's work is able to speak across the temporal divide of short-term and long-term thinking, as well as the human-nature divide. He urges us to reconnect with the land through time and he recognizes how entropy runs through nature cultures. My third and final illustration is the artist Elana Halperin, who works with processes of the earth, as her art practice engages intimately with geological processes and the people who work with them on a daily basis. In her artist statement, she writes, "My work explores the relationship between geological phenomena and daily life. Whether boiling milk in a 100°C sulfur spring in the crater of an active volcano, or celebrating my birthday with a landmass of the same age, the geologic history and environmental situation specific to the locale directly informs the direction each piece takes. Recent projects take as a starting point a personal experience with an unexpected geological phenomenon. Increasingly, interconnected events of a political, historical, and everyday nature are progressively drawn together to form a narrative. Each story explores the changeable nature of landmass, using geology as a language to understand our relationship to a constantly evolving world." There are many other artists who take time and the geological to the center of their work, drawing our attention to what lies above, around us, and also beneath our feet. With these three art practices, I bring to a close this rather brief look at how we might formulate intergenerational aesthetics by drawing on ideas from the history of aesthetics, from environmental aesthetics, and also from the arts. My hope is that this will open up a future aesthetics for future aesthetics. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Our last speaker is Patricia Johansson, whose works may be familiar to many of you.
Yes. Is this good? Okay. So I'm an artist with no background in philosophy, and I'll try to answer 3 questions and then present some of my own work. First, is there any difference between environmental activism and environmental art? And I believe there is a huge difference, because while art can incorporate an activist agenda, the goals and practice of environmental activism do not produce a work of art. Although all human beings have an innate appreciation of color, form, light and shadow, and compositional relationships, and I use these elements as an artist to draw people into a dialogue with nature. But as an environmental activist, I need to persuade people of the value of seeing beyond their own immediate interests by leading more sustainable lives and preserving nature itself. And my strategy for promoting this ethical dimension is to frame the natural world within an aesthetic context and let people form their own relationships. Second, what is the role of aesthetics in my work that distinguishes it from environmental remediation done by biologists or engineers? Art is always about the relationship between what is created and the people experiencing it. So while my art projects may achieve the same remedial results in terms of purifying water, restoring species, and reconnecting ecosystems, and while the work of restoration ecologists can be stunningly beautiful, such as a restored prairie, our goals are entirely different. Human beings and their aesthetic experiences are at the center of my work. It is the sculptural form, bright colors, and large-scale configurations that draw people in, whereas most scientifically oriented professionals are disinterested in how their sites are experienced or composed. In fact, their restored sites are often preserves where human visitation is discouraged, since people are considered the problem. Third, what is the role of aesthetics in environmental art? Sensory perception is fundamental to all human beings, and it is the aesthetic elements in my work that first catch people's attention, stimulating their own imaginations and encouraging them to explore my projects. But like an engineer or scientist, I have goals, and am ultimately interested in results. Aesthetics plays a crucial role in my environmental projects by engaging the audience, encouraging them to form personal connections, and leading them into a dialogue with ancillary issues, such as the lives of animals and the importance of wildlife habitat, preserving endangered species, and framing large-scale infrastructure as environmental sculpture and multifunctional public parks. One of my earliest projects, Cyrus Field from 1970, organized 3 forest ecologies by means of a continuous line of materials while preserving the natural setting intact. Each material was aesthetically related to the color and texture of its surroundings, creating a pattern interwoven with the existing landscape. Marble was juxtaposed with white birch trees. Redwood was camouflaged against a carpet of red needles within a dense pine forest. And flowing configurations of cement block undulate over hilly topography. By mediating between human scale and the undifferentiated vastness of nature, Cyrus Field incorporates the world around it, transforming the woods into an infinite series of ever-changing compositions. Ecological and seasonal colors and textures, varying light and weather conditions, the reflected shadows of leaves and clouds, the contours of the terrain all become part of the work of art. Over the years, the project has inspired a cadre of environmentalists by engendering personal discoveries that are unrelated to its formal design. Animal burrows, memento mori, snakes, frog ponds, and tiny landscapes that have evolved on the sculpture as art and landscape transform over time. Fair Park Lagoon in Dallas, designed in 1981, seeks a fusion of aesthetic form, functional infrastructure, and living ecology where every element is part of a larger system whose parts are intricately related. The sculptural forms are designed to control bank erosion by forming a continuous line of defense, the red segments of the drawing, preventing water from reaching the North Shore, which had previously been eroding at the rate of 8 inches a year. The purple segments on the drawing delineate a bulwark at the head of an island and additional bank armoring at strategic points. Public paths over water and arch bridges create microhabitats for a wide variety of plants, fish, turtles, and birds. The plants and animals, in turn, become living educational exhibits for the Dallas Museum of Natural History, improve water quality, and are consumed and perpetuated as members of the food chain. The entire 5-block-long lagoon also serves as a municipal flood basin. Thus, familiar forms and paths of travel are frequently altered by fluctuating water levels. The sculptural structures provide a functional framework in which, over the past 35 years, ecological communities have evolved and life in all its messy complication has proliferated. They also provide an aesthetic framework where transient reflections, such as the mixing of blue sky and terracotta water, creates optical purple puddles where birds may drink. And so a lot of my work is right out of Impressionism, but if you weren't trained as an artist in color theory, you might not see those different colors. The largely edible successional landscape, transient water levels, resident and migratory wildlife populations, and changing weather conditions all contribute to the impression of nature moving within art. And because the sculpture is based on actual plants, people who walk the paths follow the varying curves and rhythms of the biological forms, repeating the patterns of the living plant. Fair Park Lagoon is universally perceived as art, yet it provides a powerful connection to the living world while fulfilling all the functional requirements of an engineered municipal flood basin. In 1987, when I was asked to co-design a new $30 million sewer for San Francisco, known as Endangered Garden, my goal was to restore and frame living systems and make them available to the public. I began by burying the sewer and converting the roof to a baywalk that extends for a third of a mile around Candlestick Cove, with transitional sculpture providing access to the intertidal life of marsh mudflats and longshore barrier spit. The form chosen for the art was the endangered San Francisco garter snake, whose linearity and patterns meshed with the range of habitats I wanted to create. The head of the snake became a 20-foot-high earth mound that protects butterflies from crosswinds and allows them to inhabit a meadow filled with nectar and larval host plants. The snake's head echoes surrounding landforms, San Bruno Mountain and the curving Candlestick Cove, incorporating borrowed landscape into a monumental snake image and visually linking microcosm and macrocosm. Colors reflect the site and its inhabitants, from the purple mussels and ribbonworms seen in the intertidal zone to the light of the bay and the living snake. Now part of a California state park and the Bay Circuit Trail, few people realize that sewage is underfoot. Ellis Creek Water Recycling Facility, 2001 to 2009, also known as Petaluma Wetlands Park, incorporates massive constructed and natural wetlands into a multi-purpose project that processes sewage, grows agricultural crops, restores wildlife habitat, and produces recycled water. 4 miles of trails provide access for recreation, school programs, and nature study, while simultaneously containing pond water and furnishing truck maintenance routes. Despite its grounding in infrastructure, this has become Petaluma's most popular park, inhabited by legions of wildlife, including 8 threatened and endangered species that have chosen to make this their home. Biological autonomy has been restored to the Petaluma site by connecting it with surrounding ecosystems, while 45 acres of pond shaped like an endangered mouse perform human services within hundreds of acres of restored mouse habitat. So it's not just an image. We've restored over 300 acres of habitat for this endangered mouse. Within each pond, and these are the eyes of the mouse, within each pond, eyes direct the flow of water as part of the sewage treatment process, but also serve as protected nesting and refuge for birds. While Morning Glory Pools creates habitat while cleansing stormwater from roads and parking lots. The project has attracted a wide range of users, including recreational boaters who enter the wetlands at high tide. Many people assume that my images are added after all the basic engineering and environmental design has been completed, whereas actually these configurations grow organically as solutions to design problems. In this case, trail system, water circulation, sewage processing, stormwater purification, and wildlife restorations, which are all on the mouse's footprint. The final project, the Draw at Sugar House in Salt Lake City, is a Utah state dam that channels catastrophic floods down the stem of the sago lily under an 8-lane highway through a narrow slot canyon, the flood walls and spillway for the dam, and back into an incised creek. Floodwater overtopping the detention basin in Sugar House Park will pool in the bowl of the Flower with its 30-foot-high walls before flowing by gravity under the road and through a sunken corridor. As the designer of the dam, I know that anyone who has not witnessed the construction process will perceive this as a work of art. In fact, the contractors themselves were mesmerized by the prospect of creating geological and sculptural formations, incorporating niches, ledges, and perches for wildlife, and inserting bat boxes in the pinnacle formations. Visitors to Echo Canyon, the spillway that memorializes the journey of Mormon pioneers through an historic landscape, are not experiencing an engineering project. In fact, they are finding their own ways to interact with the art. Like all of my designs, the draw is simultaneously aesthetic, ecological, and functional, and will primarily be seen as a public park and art interwoven with nature. So what is the difference between this project and, for example, the Hoover Dam? Both are clearly sculptural, functional, and engage an audience. So in terms of aesthetics, they may only differ in design intention and the preconceptions of viewers. Where environmental art distinguishes itself is its ethical subtext. While both dams control water, my Salt Lake City project considers the larger community, human and non-human, while the Hoover Dam is criticized for disrupting the ecology of the Colorado River and triggering numerous endangered species. Beauty may lie in the eye of the beholder, but for an environmental artist, it is not only aesthetics, but also consequences that count.
Thank you, Patricia. What I am going to do is to pose one question, which I think pertains to all the speakers, and ask them to respond. And then I won't take any more time, my time, so I would like you people to engage in discussion, okay? So what I sort of were able to tease out of three presentations is that there is this sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit reference to the ethical considerations, whether it be the sort of aesthetics being the tool to or sensibility to make a judgment on the quality of life, or whether it be placing our aesthetic experience in a larger time frame, intergenerational aesthetics, or in Patricia's case, a very explicit intention of addressing the ethical consideration, particularly the sustainability, environmental consideration. So, and this relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical, that's been my main concern in my work and in my teaching as well. So do you think that the ethical consideration is kind of ubiquitous surrounding aesthetic matters? Can there be any aesthetics without reference to or within the context of ethical considerations? Probably it's a too general question, but you can take it any way you want. So aesthetics seems to be ubiquitous. I mean, that's clear because we are sensory creatures, always sort of interacting with the environment through our senses. But within that sort of aesthetic interaction with the environment, is there a sort of ethical anchor all the time that we may not even realize? So I don't know whether that's a...
Let me start. Is this on? Let me start by saying that it seems to me a very important thing to be clear about from the very start in talking about environmental issues is to understand what environment is. Most people talk about the environment as if it's something out there. That's a misnomer. Environment is not out there, it's here. It's here with us, in which we are a part. So anything we do that has environmental consequences we're doing to ourselves. It affects us. And consequently, it has ethical import. But I think the clear orientation of understanding the significance of environment for any such discussion is to recognize that it's not something apart from us. It includes and encapsulates human beings.
Thank you. Yeah, do you?
Well, so I thought that was a brilliant statement, because when you think about it, there's a finite amount of water, and the same water that the dinosaurs drank is flowing through our bodies and passing on through the whole system, and if you think about how just our own bodies interact with everything, it's important to know that environmental, it is us. And so, just as an artist, it bothers me a lot when people, I know they're just like pointing things out, but when they do things that are detrimental to make a point, instead of fixing the problem, they add to the problem, kind of thing. And that's just my own personal point of view. But, I think it's important to, as an environmental artist, to work with the environment and fix things,
Yeah, thank you.
I think I agree with what's been said already, but as you know, it's a difficult question.
I know, yeah.
for a philosopher, and I suppose the line I've always toed is that, sure, that ethics is important, but that it's not sort of always explicit in our aesthetic judgments and our aesthetic engagement, and I suppose that's because I like to, perhaps I'm protective in a sense of aesthetic engagement as something that can have that pleasure and joy, and obviously also connects to moral values and environmental issues. But I'm just to quickly say, the pleasure of doing some gardening and having a robin, a foot away, literally waiting for me to turn the soil, and I can hear its little song, and so that to me, that says something in that moment that I, and maybe in a broad sense it's ethical, but I suppose in terms of the sort of philosophical views that I've always thought about, it's more of a kind of precious sensory moment.
Right, yeah. Thank you. All right. Please, from the audience, and we'll ask anyone to respond. Jonathan?
So I thought this was really, really interesting. I'd like to hear more about temporality, both for Emily and Patricia. So for Emily, the kind of natural temporality that you're discussing, this kind of cyclical temporality, is I think very important, but then you want to talk about it in relationship to intergenerational aesthetics, which is a kind of future-oriented temporality, right? So you have a historical natural temporality where there's processes which either will or will not continue, will be interrupted in various ways, but it seems that the concern for futurity and intergenerational aesthetics has to be thought of in relationship to the dominant temporal narrative of modernity in particular, which is a narrative of progress, right? And so a notion of temporality, which is not at all a cyclical notion of temporality, but a unidirectional notion of temporality. And so I wonder if you could speak some more about how that notion of cyclical time and that notion of unidirectional time maybe come into conflict with one another when we think about intergenerational aesthetics. I'll give you a moment to talk about pose that question to Patricia. So thinking about that notion of kind of natural time that Emily was discussing, where we have cycles of change, right? Part of the way any natural system works is it doesn't remain static over time, right? Rivers erode, they change the course, species come and go. It may take quite a bit of time for these changes to happen. And I wonder how you might incorporate those notions of change and development into the projects that you work on, where they appear to be sort of set up to be it's done, here it is, and it's supposed to just stay here. And so it has a very kind of humane, static notion of time in the project, where it's then you want it to be kind of in a reinstantiation of a sort of natural place. And so I wonder about that kind of notion of stasis as opposed to change in your thinking about these various projects.
Emily, are you ready to?
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I would say that I think intergenerational aesthetics, as I've been developing this sort of idea, operates on lots of different levels. And I think one level is that more immediate sensory engagement with ecology. So, the mayfly, or again, I'm thinking about Yuriko's work and cherry blossoms, the image of the passage of time as we see cherry blossoms dropping from trees. But then I think also on this much kind of longer sort of synchronic, sure, but also diachronic. And what I want to say is that there's that more immediate sensory. That's one perhaps level or one aspect of what I'm putting under this idea of intergenerational aesthetics. And that can be shorter periods of time. But I'd also say in terms of what I've also developed an idea of future aesthetics, which is really, I suppose, part of this project. And future aesthetics is trying to think about the aesthetic judgments of people in future generations, and in particular in respect to changes to landscapes that are caused by climate change, by human-induced climate change. And in those kinds of cases, again, I think we are thrown into a sort of a long-term thinking, maybe concern and care for what those experiences will be like of future generations. We may find, for example, that those future generations have actually some pretty wonderful experiences because some species, say, have migrated north, that I can enjoy in Scotland, for example. So I'm not sure if that's a great answer to the question, but it's just trying to, in a sense, think about these different levels at which maybe it's working at. Yeah. Tricia.
Okay, so I'll try, but remember, I'm only an artist.
No, that's good.
First off, I don't believe in progress. I only believe in transformation. And so, as an artist, when you create something, implicit in that is some kind of decision about the future. So, for example, when I did Cyrus Field in 1970, you have to decide if it's an outdoor piece. Are you going to maintain it or are you not going to maintain it? And my decision was always to let nature take its course. And I mean, I didn't show you the most radical transformations, but some parts of the sculpture are now covered with soil. And so in the future, there'll be an archaeological dig if anybody even knows that it's there. And that's the kind of decision you make when you do public work, particularly functional infrastructure. It is going to be maintained because it needs to be kept in running order. And so these are aesthetic decisions that the artist really makes, partly when you choose the project. Is that good enough?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Arnold? Or?
I will add one thing, which is there's no way we can possibly know the future. And so as an artist, all you can do is put something out there that you believe in, that you believe is important. And whether it survives or not is not up to you. It's up to whether it has meaning for the people who come along later and whatever sort of world, they live in. So there's no way of knowing. You just do what you want to do, what you think you should do.
I think this is a complicated question, actually, because on the one hand, aesthetic experience is direct and immediate and present. And on the other, we're talking about environmental actions and changes whose future we cannot know. We can predict, but so we're changing the world, and therefore we're changing the future, and we're changing our experience because of the changes that we're making. So it's a complicated interplay between present and and future. But of course, depending upon your philosophical orientation, the place of time in all this is more or less critical. I think it's very critical. Let me just add that there's a temporal element in the act of aesthetic appreciation. It's not a momentary thing, but it's a temporal process itself. So time is present on all kinds of levels.
Yeah, one of the things that I also thought about, from 3 presentations is that exactly what you said, that aesthetic experience is not like, aha, and then that's it. No, it's a process, and I think part of the what I got out of all your presentation is that it's a kind of like practice that we should engage in to cultivate the sort of aesthetic sensibility, so that we can have a I don't want to say better, but maybe richer experience or deeper experience. But at the same time, it goes back to the sensuous, the surface, the colors and shapes and line and texture. So it's sort of always an interplay between what literally is right there, and I think Emily's work on imagination, sort of taking. Imagination sort of taking us to another, sort of a different place, but based upon the sensuous appeal of the object. Go ahead, please.
I'm interested in how this discussion is really talking about human aesthetic experience or sensual perception. And I wondered for both Emily and Patricia, Emily, in your talk about intergenerational aesthetics, I wonder if maybe panelists could think about interspecies aesthetics. And Patricia, in your work, I was so struck by the many photographs of animals within the environments that you create, and if you've really thought about other species' sensual experiences as part of your part of the purpose of your design.
I'll start. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I suppose my short answer is that at the moment I'm sort of stuck in the question that I suppose a lot of...
You're not in the post-Anthropocene frame of mind.
Well, I think I'm very interested in animal studies, so I haven't, I've had an interest in sort of animal aesthetics, whatever that means, but at the moment I'm sort of stuck in the issue of, which is a philosophical issue, whether or not animals have make aesthetic judgments or not. And I don't think one needs to get stuck there, because I think you can talk about sensory. And I suppose I'll just say that I think Stephen, somebody help me, I want to say Stephen Daniels, but Stephen
Davies.
Thank you. Stephen Davies' book, what's it called? The Artful Species, I think is, to me, from what I have read in it and what I don't know it backwards and forwards yet, but I'm finding really helpful in answering this question. But I think you can go beyond that. You can go beyond philosophical aesthetics. You can talk about all sorts of ways in which there's sensory engagement, interspecies sensory engagement, sure. Yeah. But I can't say more than that, I'm sorry.
Needs another session. Maybe.
Yeah. Next symposium.
So the answer for me is yes, I've always thought about animals. And I began, like, when I was a very young girl in college, reading like J.J. Gibson, and being interested in how, say, a hunting spider would track its prey over its 8 eyes, and being interested that horses would see things that, and so actually looking at the perceptual systems of animals. But today, I'm much more involved in just, in understanding the animal enough to know what it needs, to know what it requires, and I could have shown many, many more images of animals that inhabit my site, but it's something I always think about. And I always create food and habitat and links to the environment. And they always, so far I've been very lucky.
You have a great audience among the...
Well, it's something I really care about, and because as their territory is constantly being diminished, it's always one of my subtexts. I'm never asked to do it, but I always do it. There's always food and habitat within every project I do.
Okay, let's see. Yep, go ahead. And then Monique and Paul.
Hello. As I'm listening, I have a few questions. I'm wondering about this idea of nature, because I think everyone, sort of used this word, and I'm wondering it's something that might be a Western invention. I think kind of like, still when I think of nature, I still think of this separation of the environment and people, and I'm thinking about this intergenerational aesthetics, and I'm thinking about indigenous knowledge and this idea of the 7 generations, and I'm wondering how much of that was an influence in your sort of journey along this idea. And I'm also kind of wondering about indigenous knowledge and their role and how important their sort of understanding and relationship to the land that they live on is going to be, sort of in this path along environmental art. And I think I'm kind of a little worried that there wasn't any sort of kind of mention of them in the presentations that anyone gave, and I think that their sort of lack of visibility was sort of, I don't know, made me uncomfortable. And I mean, I think there's a lot of different indigenous artists that are working with these things, and I'm sort of thinking about that and addressing those issues when it comes to that. And I'm also thinking about, I'm wondering about your interest in empathy as a way to achieve transformation or progress or whatever word or idea that you want, because I think it's important that through empathy or through sort of the way that we feel about what's happening to the land and to the planet, that maybe we can achieve a greater sense of care. And I think what you said about interspecies aesthetics is interesting to me, because I think, privileging the human perspective is, I think, one that achieves problems, and until we can understand that that tree that we're creating art with is our partner or our someone that we're collaborating with, or our brother or our sister, I don't think we can truly achieve real union with the land or the environment until we look at it as something that is a person to us. So,
Anybody care to
Oh, yeah, I'll be glad to answer that one, because actually my first love was all kinds of indigenous art, beginning with little Eskimo carvings, walrus tusks and things like that in the Brooklyn Museum. That was the first thing that engaged me on school trips when I was, 6 years old. And it's been an ongoing concern of mine, and I've worked very closely with Oren Lyons and people like that. It's something I really care about. And if you're interested, I'll give you an article I presented in Sweden that talks about my relation to different indigenous ideas. It was very important to me, for example, when I did the project in San Francisco, because I worked very closely with some local tribes then, and what they told me that I don't think has ever been published, that the disappearance of the shellfish in San Francisco Bay was precipitated when the U.S. government took it over and said you can no longer harvest the shellfish. And what happened was all of the oysters and bivalves died because the bay mud covered them over and they suffocated. And so there's a kind of indigenous wisdom from having worked with their local environment for so many years that we don't have as public agencies and the long view, as you said, because they've been there for such a long time. They're not designers coming in and designing something without a very thorough knowledge of the cycles and the long-term plan, long-term history. I don't know if that answers it.
Monique? Do you have anything to add?
My gosh, I could say a lot. Yeah, nature is a contested concept, absolutely. I think anybody working in environmental philosophy recognizes that. I think a lot of environmental ethics is pretty Eurocentric. Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned John Muir, but when I also talk about John Muir, because I'm doing a John Muir project now, I also talk about all the criticism of John Muir. So yeah, absolutely. I would also say I don't actually think of that robin in my garden as my sister or brother. I think it's another species. But I think that there's a lot of communion between us in certain kinds of ways. But I want to argue, as I have in some of my other work, that there's some continuity between us, but there's also a lot of difference that we need to respect. So I'm always, in the work I've done previously, I stand back a little bit from pretty strong holistic ideas, which almost want to argue for kind of oneness, because I think that can sometimes almost obliterate individuals and obliterate the important differences between species.
Well, I would have to, I just want to say one last thing.
Okay, and then we'll move
Yeah,
to the
I
next
understand.
question. Yeah.
I see what you're saying and the fact that, there might be this lack of understanding and difference, but I don't know if that's necessarily true, and I don't know, and I do know that an indigenous group that does have this belief within their, life that this thing is equal to them, this is something that is a part of their family, would also understand the difference in the role that this thing plays in the wider, environment that they live on. So I don't know if calling something your sister or brother, maybe it doesn't matter as long as you respect it, but I don't think it necessarily makes it something that is, it doesn't erase the differences or the roles that you both have and the differences in the way that you need food or sleep or whatever. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks for a wonderful panel. Emily, you mentioned the cherry blossoms that Yuriko talks about in the context of the immediacy of aesthetic experience. Yuriko, discussing the cherry blossoms, talks also about the context of the celebration of the evanescence of the cherry blossoms, and in particular in light of the kamikaze pilots modeling their actions on that celebration of evanescence. That raises for me the question about where the norms come from of your intergenerational aesthetics, especially when you have these instances where various sensory immediacies in various contexts can acquire different valences, negative and positive. And since, Arnold, you were also talking about normative criteria and enriching experiences versus harmful experiences, I was just wondering, and I know it's a fairly broad question, where you see the norms as coming from and how you see the norms as grounded, the grounding of the norms that your environmental aesthetics subscribe to, and how you go about negotiating those tensions between the harmful or the negative and the positive or the enriching.
Do you want to think about it, or do you want to respond? Arnold, do you have?
I'm not really clear about the point of the question. It seems to me that this relates also to the previous question, that nature is not out there. Nature is in relation to humans. We can't know anything that's beyond the human scope. And so values that the normative standards have to do with the well-being of humans and the well-being of the human environment, which is what we call nature. It's still difficult for me to focus on the point of your question, but I would say that when I was trying to talk about aesthetics as questioning, it's critical aesthetics, and aesthetic criticism of natural practices in relation to nature, practices of all sorts, makes aesthetics a powerful analytic and political tool, because we relate what goes on in our relation to nature, in our social systems, to how it affects our perception, how it affects our sensibility, how it affects the qualities of our lives. And that's a normative standard of the most fundamental sort.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing. I think it relates more to the previous question, but it was the question of empathy. And no, I don't think we can really know what goes on in those inner lives. But what we can do is draw parallels. So, for example, if you see a wounded animal, if you see a mother defending her chicks, I mean, that we understand that. We understand that as human beings. If we're a mother, we understand those issues. And so that is another reason why it's very important for me to put these animals out there and let people see what's happening to them, because they can relate to them on that kind of level.
As a moderator, I'm not supposed to interject, but because you mentioned my discussion of cherry blossoms, just briefly follow up on Arnold's point, that cherry blossoms in Japan is really, really potent aesthetics, for better or worse, because we have a long sort of a history of aesthetics of finding beauty in that ephemeral beauty, because cherry blossoms blossom and then 2-3 days later falls to the ground, but they don't go, they go like this, so it's very elegant. Okay, so we have this long history. Now, the sort of the politically problematic use of that power of the aesthetic has to do with kamikaze pilot. There was this real military utilization of that symbolism and the aesthetics, the power of aesthetic to aestheticize the beauty, elegant beauty of the falling soldiers, literally. And there are all these other sort of symbolisms, the items which related to cherry blossom. So that's one. On the other hand, when tsunami hit 2011, so tomorrow is the 5th year anniversary. And Susan Vanderkloster, my good friend, we watched this movie called, which was made right after that, called Tsunami and Cherry Blossoms. And there, because right after that huge, disaster hit, cherry blossoms started blossoming, because that's a sort of eternal cycle, right? Although there's a huge destruction. And there was a film about interviewing people about their experience, and so many of them really refer to cherry blossoms and its vitality, regardless of what happened, and to sort of derive strength to move, keep moving. So it becomes really complicated that the cherry blossoms in Japan is very, very powerful through aesthetics, but it can be used in a very problematic way, as Arnold mentioned, or it can be a source of strength. I'm not really answering your question, but just giving you sort of a context. Sorry, I'm going to shut up. Paul, did you have?
Yeah. This was, for Emily, about intergenerationality. Arnold's previous remark about immediacy as a characteristic of aesthetic experience also helps me put the question. And the question is how you conceive of the different kinds of intergenerality that you refer to as being connected or potentially connected. In particular, what I have in mind is this. In much of the talk, you were and in your examples, say the example of Muir in Yosemite and of Terrell and of Smithson, you were focusing on the way in which certain kinds of works of nature or human beings can put the individual in touch with the longue durée and natural processes that extend way beyond the lifetime of the individual. Or that's what some of those things would seem most immediately. Of course, immediacy is always a slippery and relative term, to put the individual in touch with. And not necessarily and directly to put the individual in touch with future generations, which seems to be, or for that matter, past generations, which seems to be built into the meaning of your term. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how, if there is such a connection, and if that connection is a conceptual connection or a causal connection, or how that works.
Okay, I hope I understand the question correctly. Thank you. Well, I suppose I would then maybe, again, sort of mention this paper I've written, which is called Aesthetics, Ethics, and Climate Change, where some of these ideas are discussed. And there I do talk about imagination, the role of imagination. So the kind of, this idea of ampliative imagination, which might amplify, say you see a U-shaped valley, okay? And ampliative imagination might enable you in an aesthetic experience to imagine the glacial erosion that created that valley. And so you're making a link through imagination to the immediate sensory qualities, to some kind of historical, geological process. So that's maybe one example. I'm not sure if that's quite what you're talking about.
Well, the question was specifically about intergenerationality.
Okay.
So that example, it seems to me, puts you in touch with the past. Perhaps I think about how those processes would continue in the future, but specifically, how does it put you in touch with other generations of human beings?
People, okay.
And their potential aesthetic responses.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And there again, in that paper, what I do talk about is future generations, and I talk about questions like, which I mentioned earlier, how might we think about our present actions and what effects they might have on the aesthetic experiences of future generations of a particular place. So if we know that place is changing due to climate change, what are some of the kinds of aesthetic changes that we might be able to predict, actually? Because we can make aesthetic predictions. We make aesthetic predictions all the time when we do gardening, for example, or when we do ecological restoration. We make predictions about what the aesthetic properties might be in that future place, a year from now, 10 years from now, or further on. So I suppose there, just to throw out an example, what about my present experience? My family's in Florida, living in Florida at the moment, so I spend time, in Florida environments, which are incredibly biodiverse, but cheap by jowl with development. And I know that a lot of these places are going to be gone. They're going to be underwater in 50 years, And developers, of course, deny that. And so, take that case. I'm standing, on a bay, and I'm enjoying bird life, enjoying, all the aesthetic qualities. And then imagining, really, and this kind of gets back to Monique's question about norms, but not a very good answer, the kind of tragic beauty, perhaps, of that. These birds, we need to talk about an example like that, a hypothetical example. We can talk about massive extinctions that are already taking place due to climate change. So that's maybe an example of putting us in touch with what the future aesthetic judgment or experience of someone in that place might be. So it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Don?
Thanks. There's so many things in this that causes the mind to explode with possibilities, but possible thoughts. But it seemed to me that one of the things of the aesthetic experience about is the way in which an experience feels, overall experience. And I like the notion that Emily brought up of levels. It seems like we're talking about, when you talk about ethics, we might be talking about another level of analysis. So it could be a conceptual one, it could be ecological. Sometimes we go from the ecological to the ethical, and then relate the two. But it seems to be your notion of Hutchinson, of unity in variety. If we think of these levels, if we go to Yuriko's golf course, right, which is maybe absolutely beautiful or may have been beautiful at one time, but by today's norms that are developing, it's worrisome. So if we think about, say, a beautiful golf course, and we think about the level, moving up to that level, the unity of those two considerations fractures the aesthetic experience. It causes us to question it in a way that is part of the norms, right? It's because we care about that, it begins to cause our experience of the first to change. And so maybe to put a kind of example of this to bring Patricia in this is, can you design a aesthetically coherent and involving this larger level of ethics, say a golf course? Would you?
I just think your point is so great. I mean, is it beautiful if it's detrimental? And if we know that, a lot of people don't know that. And that's where environmental education comes in, is you tell people what the consequences of this beauty are, and then they may no longer consider it beautiful. And I think your point is fabulous. I really do.
Maureen?
I just want to bring in, kind of referring back to the question again of norms and normative experience. I feel like, as an artist anyway, it's time for us to fix things. You know, an aesthetic experience that's just nice, you know, that even if it, you know, influences or affects my imagination, great. But I feel like our priorities have to be a little different and more intense. So, for example, when you show the Smithson, of course people should know about Smithson, and there's nothing harmful about that, but it's a little problematic in the sense that it's so idealized, you know. It somewhat, well, I don't really feel this about this piece, but like some of the Walter de Maria pieces, like the Lightning Field, I feel like that is just gilding the lily, please, you know. But somebody like the Rodin Crater, you know, like I feel like that work is so extremely male and so expresses a kind of dominance over nature that I would like to see you, when you show that, I would just advocate critique, you know. Don't just show that as like, here's a beautiful experience that we can have. Because, you know, I think we're beyond that. We're so far beyond that, you know, and at the same time we're dealing with people who don't want to admit, like you said, the developers, you know, people who don't want to admit what's going on. So we're in a position where we have to try and fix things, you know, or at least offer a critique of what's out there, rather than saying this is, you know, good for the imagination.
Well, if I can respond to that, then the philosophers in the room are just like all going, oh, no. You know, I mean, and yeah, and my students ask me all, I mean, I teach environmental ethics, and my students ask me all the time, well, what about fixing things? And I'm like, well, I think I'm kind of helping here. I'm educating you. I'm teaching you about environmental values. I get a few vegetarians out of the class by the end of the class, you know. But I don't teach it as an advocate, because I don't. For me, in an educational context, I don't think that's my role. But I'll say, and I'm sure that Arnold and Patricia have responses to say it too. Yeah, I mean, I'm a shameful lover, in particular, of Robert Smithson's work. I say shameful lover. I don't know. I just think I just love his work. And you know, when I chose these 3 art practices, I would recognize that actually a lot of the talk was pretty gendered toward men. And I try not to do that in other work, and particularly in my teaching as well, but okay, it was there. I have written critically about artists, in particular in relation to the use of animals in art. So, you know, I take your point, absolutely. But I also, as a philosopher and as someone who's interested in those precious aesthetic moments, I think we have to stand back. I don't want aesthetics to be politicized all the time. It's just not. That's my standpoint. But I'm very aware of the ethical issues. I just don't always put them to the fore. Yeah.
I actually want to respond to that too, because I was a good friend to Smithson, and it really goes to gender issues, because I actually built Cyrus Field at the same year that the spiral jetty was created, and knew all of those male earthwork artists, and they were the only ones Art Forum was publishing. And so there were a whole group of female artists doing very sensitive, ethical projects in nature. But, you know, and by the way, you know, they all came and saw our projects, but you couldn't get any traction then. And so I think you just have to think about it as past history. You know, it's a fact of history. That's what was important at the time, and it was, you know, and we weren't. But if you think about cycles, something else can come to the fore, and it's certainly doing that now.
Arnold, would you like to add?
I actually would like to shift this and the previous question to a different frame. Temporality and normativity and intergenerationality. I would like to shift it to, well, we could call it urban change. The human world is not just in relation to nature, it's in relation to the world that we construct for ourselves, the built environment. And much of what is done without both appreciation and recognition of the values of the past and of the future. I'm involved at the moment in my little village in Maine, where we have a historic village which has many old houses and buildings and narrow streets, and the city, or the town fathers, want to widen the main street, which is the iconic street of the village. And there's a whole movement trying to stop them, and it's a very ugly political situation. But what's at stake is valuing the character of, preserving the character of the village for future generations, so people will know what a village like this was like and recognize its special beauty. So there's a whole domain of this issue having to do with the changes and values in the human built environment. So I just wanted to be sure that was included in this consideration of normativity.
Right, okay. Let's see, Anne?
Thank you. I really enjoyed this panel so much. All of you, thanks so much. I have a very particular question for Patricia. I want to go back to the Petaluma Reservoir. You said something very interesting about the relationship between the form, the mouse form, and the function. If I understood you correctly, you said people think of the mouse as a kind of add-on later once I'd gotten the function set. But in fact, it grew organically out of the function. So I just want to hear more about that. I thought that was very interesting. It wasn't apparent to me in what you said how that actually worked.
Okay, so actually I was on the value engineering team. And if you know what a value engineering team is, you discuss alternatives and the consequences of. Okay, so you basically look at different alternatives, and we looked at 7 alternatives. I was the odd person on the panel. Everybody else was an engineer. I was an artist. We did 7 alternatives. 6 were mechanical. 1 was a wetland system. It required a lot of courage on the part of the people of Petaluma to select an artist design over the 6 engineering designs, but they did. And the reason they did is the way I designed it is it was very energy efficient. The water all flows by gravity downhill through the mouse, and it's only pumped up once, and it goes up toward the highway, and it goes into UV disinfection. And then if you look at that aerial view of the mouse, you can see there's a beautiful little swimming pool-like of water. That's our recycled water. During the drought in California, we've been producing all of this sewer water is transformed into recycled water, and it goes on certified organic crops. And if you look out on the hills, The only green hills are where they have our recycled water. And so the city is actually, I work with economic development as well. And the way I convinced them to do my project was the water all flows by gravity, so it's very energy efficient. It was cheaper to build, it was cheaper to maintain, and it's in an earthquake zone. So if those berms break, the water will just flow back down into the Petaluma River. And I also pointed out that the people would be getting a park, that instead of something with a chain link fence around it, they would have, I think it's more than 300 acres and 4 miles of trails that they could access. It was very inexpensive to build because everything is on the same footprint. So all of the trails are the berms. I don't know if you know what a berm is. It's a kind of elevated earthen embankment. That's what contains the pond water. But those are also the truck access routes, the maintenance routes, and those are also the public trails. The wildlife habitat is all created around the image of the mouse and within the islands in the center. And so it's a very kind of homogeneous project. And the engineers, in the end, they started out being very skeptical. But what happened was we got, I actually presented my project along with the other 6 engineering projects. And they voted for mine because the Audubon Society came out, all of the local environmental groups came out, because they wanted the habitat, they wanted the trails, they wanted the park. And they didn't want something with a fence around it. And so that was really the story. They voted to build it. And of course, I am an artist, but I have to go down to the Army Corps of Engineers, I have to go to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I have to explain my projects, why they work, why they're important. And what happened was, then you have to get the money. These are not like simple, straight line things. We invited the head of the California Coastal Conservancy to come over. Now we got the vote, we needed money. And I showed him the project and I described all of the land that people could have. And he said to me, how much do you need? And whenever I hear that, I know that the project is going to go. And he gave us $2.5 million, which was matched by Open Space, the Open Space District. And that's how it got built. And now it's been making money for the city, everybody loves it, and there are tours, all kinds of tours of the place. But it is a sewage treatment facility. That is what it is. But there's so much wildlife there that that's what people really come to see. And then jog on the trails, things like that.
Okay, yes.
I was reading an interview to this Dutch designer, Martin Baas. I was reading this interview this week to the Dutch designer Martin Baas, who is a master of aesthetic for me with the smoke collection. And anyway, he was saying that the greener thing you can do is not design at all anymore. And I wonder if you never consider a new form of aesthetic where maybe it's about emptiness, it's about not a new approach to design where there's no design and it's just a conservancy of what nature can be and the art that can come from nature, as you explained for us.
Well, it depends on, as a designer, it depends on what you want to get out of the project. For example, in the Netherlands now, I work with engineers, actually a man who founded the whole environmental engineering program at Delft, Technical University of Delft, and I've done work there. So you probably know about their Room for the River project, But if you want public access, if you want an aesthetic experience, then there needs to be some design that's coordinated with the functional things that you want to happen.
But it is a new aesthetic.
Yeah. But I think there can't be just no design. There has to be some design. But it can be very stepped down. Basically, my earlier projects, you'll see, look much more like sculpture, because that's what I was hired to do, was produce a piece of sculpture. And so that whole visioning of Fair Park, they did not ask me to design a municipal flood basin. I designed it as a municipal flood basin. But that wasn't what I was asked to do. I was asked to provide sculpture. And so all of the other programs, I have my own agenda, which is the wildlife. It's the public access. It's the park. And then now I'm asked to do infrastructure, and I still keep layering all these things on because it's important to me. But that's not what I'm asked to do.
Okay, it's 11 o'clock, but because we started late, I can take one more question. Yes. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to speak again, but I did want to go back to Paul Geyer's question about instances of looking backwards in terms of the aesthetic concerns of past generations and looking forward. And it occurs to me that, you opened with the idea, I think, that aesthetics is a field that is, beyond traditional disciplines of art history or art. And I would look at archaeology and archaeologists. I would look at experimental or experiential archaeology that's happening, and how much time people spend thinking about the aesthetic tastes of people of the past as they're recreating technologies and processes of the past. And I think that our consideration of past human aesthetics and future human aesthetics is actually with us all the time, and we may not always think of it in that way. I mean, I think of reenactment groups, the Civil War reenactment groups, who are so concerned with really the finest details of aesthetics in their recreations. And the film Lincoln, that was so praised for the imaginative way that people tried to think back to the aesthetics of the mid-19th century. And Arthur's example of his village, where the main street is something you're thinking about in terms of an aesthetics of a past village population. And then in examples of the future, I would urge us all to think of that overused example of the Voyager golden records, trying to create an object that's going to go out into space, golden discs with images on them, and trying to imagine what the aesthetic reception is of not even what is human, but something in the future. And any artist who really is concerned for legacy, I would think I'm not an artist, but I would think that it would be important, if you care about what future people are going to think of your work, that you would try to project into the aesthetic norms and considerations of future generations. And I think, Patricia, you, in a sense, implied a lot of that with the talk of where your work would eventually, what your work would eventually become.
But I just want to say one thing. We can never know. And the kind of proof of that is if you look in museums, there are many objects in museums that were never considered art at the time they were made. They were considered, just a cooking vessel or, something like that, something very utilitarian that would never be thought of as a work of art. And yet, our judgment is that it is.
I think that particular issue will be pursued in the afternoon session. Yeah, so that will be a good segue to that. I think we are going to close this session, and I want to thank the three speakers for the wonderful presentations. We'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll convene again. Thank you.